Hi, it's Klayton, aka Celldweller, Scandroid, Circle of Dust, FreakGen, and lastly, but quite possibly most importantly, Dad. Welcome to the Squeaky Chair Sessions, an interview hosted by the Vice President of FiXT, James Rhodes, sometime in 2015, 2016, or I don't know. Please enjoy.
So, I think to start, talk about what got you first into music as far as producing or making music yourself.
My earliest memory of music was probably more important to me than things I could remember on TV, and those were important, and those made very specific memories. My grandfather had a music room, and he used to put on records and throw headphones on me, and I would just sit in this chair, and as a young kid I would soak in all this music from these albums of like Moog synthesizers doing like classical music, like, you know, Switched on Bach by Wendy Carlos, and then after that there was an onslaught of just synthesizer based, Moog based albums. I would listen to that stuff and be fascinated by these sounds, these otherworldly sounds, you know, disco and jazz and just classical music, a little bit of everything. So I've been fascinated by music, and then at the age of 13, I believe I was, my mother came home from work one day and said, "Hey, there's this woman at work. She got her son a drum kit, and he doesn't play it anymore, or he moved off to college," something like that. It ended up being a really cheap, it was a cheap drum set. Her mom's like, "Do you want to play the drums?" And I was like, oh, I couldn't believe I was getting asked. I was like, oh my God, yes. So my mom got me this drum kit. I set it up in my basement, and I had no idea I wish I had a picture of how I had it set up, because I didn't have any single drum in the right place at all, because I didn't know how it went. This is all pre-internet. There was nobody to ask, so I didn't know what I was doing. And that was actually the first instrument that I really pursued. I played the trombone in second grade. So you had to take a music class. I played the trombone because they only offered classical instruments, so it was brass or strings. At this moment, I wish I would have taken a stringed instrument. I would have taken that instead of brass per se. But so I did play the trombone in second grade. That was really my first instrument. But I started pursuing the drums in 6th or 7th grade, whenever that was. So that was me actually starting to make music, and from there, you know, as these things go, you meet some other people who, I play guitar, I play bass, I sing. So you start putting together these bands, and you just jam. And I spend a lot of my teenage years jamming in bands and playing and perfecting.
When did you switch from drums to guitar?
As soon as possible. I realized after playing with other musicians, I realized two things. One, they didn't want a drummer to have any other input except sitting behind the drum kit and keeping time. So I never really had any musical input, which really kind of pissed me off. And two, I realized that I had a desire to do more than just sit behind the drums and be told to shut up. I wanted to create, I wanted to write, but in order to do that, I needed some form of a melodic instrument. So what I would do is I would watch the guitar player really closely to see what he would do, ask questions occasionally, and whenever anybody left their station and went out for a drink or something and left their guitar sitting on their amp, I'd pick it up and I would start figuring out how to play basic power chords. And so from there I got I think it was like a $60 or $70 guitar from Sears or something. It was the worst, but I didn't care and I didn't know. I had no idea. And I started putting in as much time practicing on that as I did the drums, because I realized now I've got two instruments, so I know what beats I could play over this guitar riff I'm trying to create. And you know, I didn't really spend a lot of time studying other people's music and learning other people's songs and wanting to do covers of that. Kind of taught me how to play a little bit. I just heard things in my head, so I had to learn how to play well enough so that I could get these ideas out of my head into these guitar riffs. So right from the beginning, I was more concerned about being creative than being an emulation of anything else.
When did you first realize you could record that and capture what you were playing live into a recording?
My grandfather gave me a reel-to-reel, an old reel-to-reel tape machine. So it was a 1/4 inch, you know, it was small. It wasn't a large format tape player, but it was enough for me to take one of this cheap Radio Shack microphones that he gave me, plug it in, and realize that I could record audio. So some of the bands I used to mess around with, we would plug a live microphone in the room, just a single microphone, and record rehearsals. Then when I started realizing is there were multiple tracks in these things, so I could record a drum beat and then go back later and play a guitar over it. So I was like, wow, I could play 2 instruments myself without anybody else. And later on, I saved all the money I had made washing dishes in an Italian restaurant, and spent it on making a demo at a studio. It was only an 8-track. They only had an 8-track studio, and I recorded like this metal demo way back when. So I realized, as more time went on, I realized that I could record, and I eventually got a 4-track, and that really revolutionized my world. But before that even happened, I discovered the sequencer, and that really blew my perception of what I could do musically on my own wide open, because now I had this machine that I could play multiple tracks, play drums, keyboards, and then with even that reel-to-reel tape machine I had, lay that down on one track and then play guitar riffs and sing over this on the second track or something like that. And then when I got a 4-track, I was able to do that times 4. So it just kind of exponentially grew, in a way that wasn't very precise. I didn't really know what I was doing. I didn't have any information from anybody, so I didn't even know what I was going for. I just kind of would stumble across somebody mentioning, a 4-track, and I would then be like, okay, what's a 4-track? And I'd go down to the local store and have somebody show me what a 4-track did. And I annoyed all the sales guys that were making $2 an hour at the local music store, because they oftentimes would act annoyed because I asked a lot of questions, because there was no other resource. But I was so hungry, I didn't care. I just wanted to know. Somebody tell me something. So that I started digging for information and discovering along the way.
So you would have been a teenager still at that point when you got the sequencer and the...
Mm-hmm.
And did you... Everything self-taught? Did you take lessons anywhere for any of the instruments?
Apart from the trombone lessons that I had to take in school, which don't really count for much, I decided once I started playing drums that I needed drum lessons, because I thought the way to proceed was learning how to read music. So I'm really fortunate that I had really supportive parents, and they got me a few lessons at a local music shop. And I remember the book, I think I still have it. It was called Rockin' Bass Drum, and it was a little book of basic beats. And I learned how to read quarter notes, eighth notes, and then hi-hat versus bass drum versus snare drum. And I started playing these beats, and I would go once a week to these lessons, only for a couple of months. That's all we could afford. And I learned enough to then continue through that book on my own, because I was that determined. And then I just started trying to emulate the music I was hearing. So my history of drum lessons was very short-lived. I took, I think, 2 or 3 lessons later on in life with a guy who was like a drummer in some famous metal band who lived near me in New York. And because he was referred to me by someone else, I went and took a few lessons, and then I realized, okay, cool, a lot of what he's teaching me I could just figure out on my own. And I didn't want to spend my money on somebody teaching me how to play the drums. I'd rather just save money and try to buy gear. So I took almost no drum lessons. I've never taken any guitar lessons or any other instrument lessons. Everything else I've learned, I figured out on my own. Barring college, I was pre-med, so I was studying to be a doctor. And I didn't really want to be. I really wanted to play music, but there was no way to make money playing music. And at some point, I decided, you know what, I need to try this. So I switched my major to music. And that only lasted 1 semester, because during that semester I actually got a record deal on a very, very small label. But that was enough for me to be like, I'm going to work full time and try to make music. So I dropped out. But during that semester, part of what you had to do was learn how to play Beethoven and Bach and all that. And I respect those guys, of course. They definitely set the trends, and they were the rock stars of their era. But I had no intention or desire to play somebody else's music. But it did teach me some rudiments about how to play the keyboard. But reading music and everything else, I wasn't interested in learning theory, because all that did is make me think about music mathematically, and I didn't want to think about music mathematically. I wanted to feel it. I wanted what I heard in my head to come out, not go, well, I can't move in parallel fifths because my teacher said you can't do that. So I dropped out of school, and then I moved, but outside of that, there really was no formal education.
What was the biggest step forward in gear or learning as far as production early on? outside of getting the 4-track and the sequencer?
That was the beginning. And so what I did is I actually got a record deal through a series of fortunate events, I guess. I just happened to be friends with this band that was signed to a label, and one of the guys in the band was suddenly made the A&R rep for the label. So he was looking to land some signings. And because he knew me and I had just started doing something industrial when industrial was just coming up, he's like, oh, like literally gave him a demo that I made without a sampler. All I had was my 4-track. I had my Canyon boombox, which I would turn on the shortwave radio through a delay pedal I had in real time to one of the tracks on the 4-track to create these semblance of noise, like there was something programmed in there, because I didn't have a sampler. I couldn't do that. And I would cut a vocal and a guitar, and that was my demo. I had 1.5 songs that I had demoed. And I sent him those 1.5 songs, and I got a call at my job. Somehow he tracked me down at the place I worked, and I got a call, and I picked up the phone, and he was like, we want to sign you. And it was like, it was almost like an episode of Twilight Zone. I felt time had stopped, because it was one of those things where somebody tells you something, and it's too overwhelming to believe, so time sort of freezes. And I remember staring at the handset of the phone, looking at it. I don't even know how long I was there doing that. And then I was like, what? And he's like, we want to sign you. We're going to send you a contract. We want to sign you. And back then, that was the only way you could make it in music, was signing a contract, quote unquote. The illustrious label contract, which was a joke of a contract that I signed, but I didn't know that at the time. So part of the deal, I said, guys, the demo that I did, I don't have any gear. I'm like, so I don't know if you can afford this, but I need a sampler. So that was a pretty big revolutionary moment for me, was getting the sampler. And then what quickly followed after that was the next revolutionary thing. So these two are kind of coincided. I get the sampler, and my Roland D20 keyboard was extremely primitive as a sequencer, and that's what I was using to sequence. So if I was writing a verse and a chorus of a song, and I wanted to go back to the verse, I couldn't copy and paste the verse that I made. I had to create in a linear fashion. I couldn't make little sequences and paste them. So what I had to basically do was rewrite the verse from scratch and try to remember what I did, and then rewrite the chorus if I wanted to hear the chorus again. So I learned early on how to write in a really progressive way. My songs never really did anything twice, because it was more work for me to try to emulate what I had already done than just create a new part. So I actually learned how to write in a more progressive way almost by accident. Then I switched to the sampler, because it had a built-in sequencer. And that was a little more robust, but I was having all kinds of timing issues and MIDI issues. I was having all kinds of issues just making songs on this thing. And somehow or another, I had met a guy who had put out an album, and it was like electronic in nature, and somebody hooked us up, because back then there was no internet, so it wasn't like I got an email or I texted the dude. I mean, those things didn't even exist. So somebody recommended us to each other. He actually took some time, and I called him on the phone, and he started talking me through some of what I was doing, and he was like, I have a simple solution for you, which wasn't very simple at all. He's like, you need a Mac. You need to go out and you need to buy a Mac, and you need a copy of Studio Vision Pro and use that as a sequencer. And there's no way I could afford a $2,300 computer. I think I was working a part-time job making $3 an hour. Like literally that was what I was making, like $3 an hour. Or it could have been less at that time. I think I maxed out, when I worked a day job, I maxed out at $3.35 an hour. When I quit my day job for the last time in my life and went full-time music, the last job I had, I was paid minimum wage, which is $3.35 an hour.
Wow.
So that's when that happened. So I fortunately have great parents, and my mom was like, if you need this, I'll let you put this on one of my credit cards, but I can't pay it. You've got to pay it. And I was like, and only reason she ever offered is because she knew I was responsible. I was like, anything I wanted, I worked my ass off to get, and I was responsible about it, and I was hungry for it. So she knew that allowing me to do this, she wasn't going to get stuck with a bill that I wasn't going to pay. And of course I did. I paid it off. But that allowed me to get a computer, and that using now this Mac Classic, which had a 1 megabyte of RAM and a 40 megabyte hard drive, running Studio Vision Pro off of floppy disks, you know, revolutionized my life. And I didn't have anybody, I didn't even know how to use a Mac. I didn't know how to use a computer. I didn't know how to use any of the software. And the only way for me to learn was to actually read the 400 or 500 page manual that came with the software. So that is literally what I did. There was no video tutorials. Nobody at the music store was going to help me. One guy basically shut me down one day and said, look, you're asking too many questions. If you want my help, you got to pay me $40 an hour and I'll come over and teach you. And basically I gave him a big middle finger and I was like, I'll figure this out myself. So I went home and I read manuals, and I had no friends. I had no life. I read and experimented. I'm like, I don't know what this does. It says to do this, and let me do, oh wow, that does work. Okay, now I figured out how to record a sequence. And that's how I learned everything I did. Me, myself, and I, the three of us.
Hours and hours.
Hours, weekends, anytime I had that I wasn't working or I wasn't in school. And at that point, I had gotten the record deal, so I would have been out of school. So I had to work full time because now I didn't have school. Although I paid for my own schooling, I think I took a loan out or something so I could pay that back gradually. Whereas now I wasn't in school, so there was no resource of money. I had to work. I never went out with anybody. I never spent money on food. I ate the cheapest foods, you know, like.
So that first album, or at what point after you got signed, where you were still keeping a day job to pay for your gear, at what point did you quit a day job and go full time?
Oh, yeah. To be honest, that's right. I'm getting my timeline screwed up. So, I didn't actually quit my day job full time. My full time day job. I didn't quit that until the Argyle Park album, which happened in 1994.
So you did.
So I did
the
debut twice. So I did the debut album twice.
Circle
I did
Dust.
Brainchild twice, and I did Metamorphosis, which is an entire remix album, all with the same amount of gear, while working a full-time job. So what I did is I dropped out of school, but I had to work full-time, and I did that for 3 or 4 albums. And then when I did Argyle Park in 1994, I basically worked it out. I told the label, look, if you want me to do this, I need a mixing board, and it was like $500 or $1,000 that I needed, that I knew was going to keep me alive for maybe 3 or 4 months while I worked on the record. And after that, I was like, I'm probably going to need to go find another job. And that was...
So did they advance enough for you to buy a board, or how did you get a board?
They advanced me.
And what board did you get?
I got a Mackie 24x8 mixer.
You don't still have that?
I sure do. It's upstairs in my workout room. Uh-huh. Although at this point it's now a 32 channel one, because I had a 24. My brother got a 32, and one at one point was like, this is too big for me. I need a smaller board. I'll just do a straight up trade for a 32 channel board. I thought I was in heaven. I was like, wow, I'm going to get a 32 channel board. I'm just doing a straight trade. Yes.
Cool.
With a meter bridge, which I didn't have on my 24, so I totally did that trade. So I now have the 32 channel Mackie, which unfortunately is just sitting in a room right now not being used, but it could be.